The crystal chandeliers cast perfect light across Boston's Grand Hotel ballroom as Garrett Whitmore raised his hand to signal security ready to humiliate the homeless man who'd somehow wandered into his charity gala. The weathered figure stood near the magnificent Steinway grand piano, his torn jacket a stark contrast against the sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. Garrett had no idea he was about to witness something that would shatter everything he believed about worth, dignity, and the devastating price of turning away from those who need us most. That homeless man was Nathaniel Rivers, and the next hour would change both their lives forever. The Boston Grand Hotel ballroom glowed with the kind of elegance that only extreme wealth can create. 300 of the city's most influential residents filled the space, their conversations mixing with the soft clink of champagne glasses and the delicate notes from a string quartet. Women wore gowns worth more than most people's monthly rent. Men adjusted cufflinks that cost what some families spent on groceries for a year. The air itself seemed perfumed with success, with arrival with the unspoken certainty that everyone in this room belonged here. This was the annual Arts for All Gala, the crown jewel of the Whitmore Foundation's charitable calendar. For the past decade, this single evening had raised millions of dollars for music education programs across Massachusetts. Tonight's goal was ambitious even for this crowd: $3.5 million to fund instruments teachers and scholarships for underprivileged children who showed musical promise. The irony of what was about to unfold would not be lost on anyone by the end of the night. Garrett Whitmore stood at the podium, silver-haired and impeccable in his custom Tom Ford tuxedo. At 48, he'd built his family's foundation into one of the most respected philanthropic organizations in New England. His speech flowed with practiced ease, hitting all the right notes about opportunity talent and the transformative power of music education. The audience nodded along, already reaching for their checkbooks. "Music doesn't discriminate," Garrett said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the ballroom. "It doesn't care about your zip code or your bank account. True talent can emerge from anywhere, and when it does, we have a responsibility to nurture it." The words sounded beautiful. They would soon taste like ash in his mouth. That's when the commotion started near the service entrance. Nathaniel Rivers hadn't planned to attend the gala. He'd been searching for a warm place to spend the evening somewhere out of the October wind that cut through his threadbare jacket like it wasn't even there. The hotel's service corridor had seemed promising, at least until the noise and light spilling from the ballroom had drawn him closer. And then he'd seen it. Through the partially open door gleaming under the chandeliers like a promise from another life. A Steinway Model D concert grand piano. Nate hadn't seen a piano like that in 5 years. Hadn't touched any piano in 5 years. The sight of it hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his fingers twitch with muscle memory so deep it felt like drowning. He didn't remember deciding to enter the ballroom. One moment he was in the corridor, the next he was inside, drawn forward by something stronger than common sense or self-preservation. The piano called to him the way water calls to someone dying of thirst in a desert. The security guard spotted him within seconds. Hard not to, really. Nate's appearance told its own story. His jacket, once a decent wool blend, now hung from his shoulders in tatters. His jeans were stiff with dirt and wear. His shoes, held together more by habit than by any remaining structural integrity, left faint marks on the pristine marble floor. His salt and pepper beard grew wild and untrimmed, and his dark skin bore the weathered texture of too many nights spent outside. But it was his eyes that truly marked him as different from everyone else in that room. While the gala guests' eyes sparkled with wine and self-satisfaction, Nate's eyes held something else entirely. Loss, longing, and underneath it all, barely visible, a flicker of something that might once have been hope. "Sir, you can't be in here." The security guard's voice was low but firm, his hand already on Nate's elbow. The words cut through the ambient noise. Conversations near the entrance faltered. Heads turned. The string quartet played on, but their music suddenly seemed thin, inadequate to cover the growing whispers. Garrett stopped mid-sentence, his fundraising pitch dissolving as he followed the crowd's attention. What he saw made his jaw tighten. This was exactly the kind of situation he'd paid premium security to prevent. An actual homeless person standing in the middle of his exclusive event, threatening to disrupt the carefully cultivated atmosphere of refined charity. "Remove him immediately," Garrett said into the microphone, not bothering to lower his voice. "Security, do your job." The room's energy shifted. What had been merely curious attention now focused with the sharp precision of an audience sensing drama. This was better than any scheduled entertainment. This was real. This was uncomfortable. This was, some of them would admit later, with shame thrilling in its awfulness. 2 more security guards approached. Nate stood perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the piano. He wasn't resisting, wasn't causing trouble. He was simply looking at an instrument the way a lost traveler might look at home after years of wandering. "I asked you to remove him." Garrett's voice had taken on an edge now, his polished veneer cracking slightly. "This is a private event. He doesn't belong here." And there it was, the phrase that would haunt Garrett Whitmore for the rest of his life. He doesn't belong here. 4 words that contained within them entire philosophies about worth and deserving, about who matters and who doesn't, about the invisible lines we draw between ourselves and those we've decided aren't quite human enough to warrant our compassion. Nate finally turned his attention from the piano to the man on the stage. Their eyes met across the ballroom. Neither man knew it yet, but in that moment the course of both their lives began to bend toward an inevitable collision. The security guards had Nate by both arms, now professional, but insistent in their grip. They began steering him back toward the entrance, and most of the guests had already returned to their conversations. The momentary entertainment concluded. But Nate's feet, almost of their own accord, planted themselves on the marble floor. Not with aggression, not with defiance, simply with the quiet resistance of someone who'd finally stopped running from pain. "Please," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "I just wanted to see the piano." It was the wrong thing to say, or perhaps it was exactly the right thing depending on how you measured such moments. Garrett descended from the podium, his expression hardening into something that would photograph well for the society pages but wouldn't stand up to moral scrutiny. "You wanted to see the piano?" Garrett repeated, his tone dripping with contempt. "Let me guess. You're a musician, a misunderstood genius just down on your luck, right?" He turned to address the crowd, playing to them now. "This is exactly the kind of person who preys on events like ours, looking for sympathy, looking for a handout." Some of the guests laughed. Not loud belly laughs. Nothing so crude. But polite, knowing chuckles that said they were in on the joke, that they understood the social order and where everyone belonged in it. Nate's hands trembled slightly at his sides. Not from fear, not from anger, from the simple effort of standing there while being spoken about as if he wasn't human enough to warrant being spoken to. "I'm not asking for anything," Nate said quietly. "No." Garrett moved closer, emboldened by the crowd's support. "Then what are you doing here? This event costs $5,000 a plate. Do you have $5,000? He didn't wait for an answer. "Of course you don't." "So you're trespassing, disrupting an evening dedicated to helping people who actually deserve help." That phrase again. Deserve. As if worth was something to be earned, something to be proven, something that could be lost, like loose change falling through a hole in your pocket. The thing about cruelty is that it rarely stays contained. Once unleashed, it spreads like ink in water, coloring everything it touches. The guests who'd laughed before laughed louder now. Those who'd felt uncomfortable found themselves swept up in the collective judgment, their individual consciences subsumed by the group's permission to be cruel. But not everyone joined in. Mrs. Catherine Brennan, 83 years old, and the foundation's largest donor, set down her champagne glass with enough force to create a sharp clink that cut through the laughter. She'd made her fortune in real estate, but she'd earned her reputation through an unflinching sense of right and wrong that money could neither buy nor corrupt. "That's enough, Garrett." Her voice, though not loud, carried absolute authority. The laughter died like someone had flipped a switch. Garrett turned his expression flickering between annoyance and the careful deference one shows major donors. "Mrs. Brennan, I'm simply maintaining the integrity of the event. You're humiliating a human being for entertainment," she said flatly. "And you're doing it at an event supposedly dedicated to compassion and opportunity. Explain to me how that works." The ballroom had gone silent now. Even the string quartet had stopped playing, sensing that continuing would be somehow inappropriate to whatever was unfolding. Garrett's jaw worked soundlessly for a moment. He was trapped between his desire to have Nate removed and his need to placate his most important donor. Money has its own gravity, its own rules, and Mrs. Brennan's money meant her rules tended to win. "I meant no disrespect," Garrett said carefully. "But we have procedures, security protocols." "He said he wanted to see the piano," Mrs. Brennan replied. "What's the harm in that?" It was a simple question. It shouldn't have been hard to answer. But sometimes simple questions are the ones that expose the complicated lies we tell ourselves. Garrett glanced at Nate, again really looked at him this time. What he saw confirmed every prejudice he held. The torn clothing, the unkempt appearance, the very existence of homelessness which Garrett had always secretly believed was a personal failing rather than a systemic failure. To Garrett, Nate represented everything he'd spent his life avoiding, everything he'd convinced himself he was superior to. "Fine." Garrett said the word tight with barely suppressed anger. "Let him approach the piano. Let everyone see exactly what he is." The security guards released Nate's arms. The crowd parted as he walked forward, creating a corridor that felt less like respect and more like quarantine. Nate's worn shoes made almost no sound on the marble floor. His hands, weathered and scarred, hung at his sides. The Steinway waited black and gleaming under the lights. It was worth more than $200,000, a fact the foundation made sure every donor knew. A fact that emphasized the foundation's commitment to quality, to excellence, to giving deserving students access to the very best instruments. Nate stopped 3 feet from it, close enough to see the grain in the wood, close enough to see his own reflection distorted and ghostly in the polished surface. But he didn't reach out, didn't touch. Some part of him understood that even approaching this piano was a transgression, and touching it would be crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Well," Garrett said from behind him, "you wanted to see it. Are you satisfied?" Before Nate could answer, before he could turn and walk away and disappear back into the cold October night, Mrs. Brennan spoke again. "Let him play it." The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water, sending ripples through the entire room. Garrett spun to face her, his composure finally cracking fully. "Absolutely not. That piano is worth, I know what it's worth. I helped pay for it." Mrs. Brennan's eyes were sharp behind her glasses. "Let him play. If he can move us, maybe we'll listen to whatever brought him here. If he can't, then you've proven your point and he leaves with dignity intact. Surely that's not too much to ask." It was a masterful move. She'd framed it as a challenge, appealing to the crowd's desire for entertainment, while simultaneously making it impossible for Garrett to refuse without looking like a coward. Several guests were already nodding, intrigued by the prospect. Garrett's face had gone red. He knew he'd been outmaneuvered, but he also saw an opportunity. Let the homeless man embarrass himself at the piano. Let everyone see that Mrs. Brennan's compassion was misplaced. It would be a lesson, a morality play acted out in real time. "Fine," he said. "Play. Show us all your hidden talent." He meant it sarcastically. But sarcasm, like cruelty, often reveals more about the speaker than the subject. Nate stood motionless for a long moment. In his mind, a war raged. Part of him wanted to run to spare himself the humiliation of failure. But another part of him, a part that had been buried under years of loss and pain and survival, was waking up. That part remembered what it felt like to sit at a piano, to translate emotion into sound, to speak the only language that had ever made complete sense. His hands were shaking as he moved to the bench. The audience watched with the rapt attention of Romans at the Colosseum, waiting to see if the lion would devour the condemned man. Some of them felt vaguely guilty about their anticipation. Most didn't think about it at all. Nate sat down. The bench's cushion felt almost offensively comfortable compared to the cardboard and concrete he'd slept on for the past 5 years. He adjusted his position, slightly muscle memory, guiding movements his conscious mind had tried to forget. His hands hovered over the keys. 88 keys, each one a doorway to everything he'd lost. To his wife. To his daughter. To the man he used to be before the world broke him into pieces too small to reassemble. In the audience, someone coughed. Someone else whispered something that might have been a bet about how quickly this would end in disaster. Garrett stood with his arms crossed, a thin smile playing at his lips. Mrs. Brennan simply watched, her expression unreadable. And Nathaniel Rivers, who hadn't touched a piano in 5 years, who'd once been called one of the most promising classical musicians of his generation, who'd lost everything that mattered, and was now being offered a chance to reclaim one small piece of his shattered self, took a breath and let his fingers fall to the keys. But to understand what happened next, you need to know how Nathaniel Rivers became the man sitting at that piano. You need to understand the journey from concert halls to street corners, from standing ovations to standing in soup kitchen lines. You need to know about Grace and Lily and the moment when everything broke. So let's go back. Back to when Nate's hands weren't weathered from sleeping rough. Back to when his name meant something in the world of classical music. Back to before the world taught him that worth isn't inherent, it's assigned, and it can be taken away in the time it takes for a diagnosis to come back from the lab. Let's go back 12 years. 12 years ago, Nathaniel Rivers was not sitting in a ballroom being judged by strangers. He was standing in a classroom at Berklee College of Music in Boston, teaching a seminar on advanced piano technique to 18 of the most talented young musicians in the country. At 39, Nate had achieved what most classical pianists only dream of. He'd performed at Carnegie Hall 3 times. He'd recorded 2 albums that critics called transcendent and emotionally devastating in the best possible way. He'd been profiled in The New Yorker and interviewed for NPR's Piano Jazz. But of all his accomplishments, teaching was what he loved most. "Listen," he told his students that afternoon. his hands demonstrating a complex passage from Rachmaninoff's Second Concerto. You're not just playing notes, you're having a conversation. The piano speaks, you speak back. It asks questions, you answer. It challenges you, you rise to meet it. His students watched with the kind of focused attention that only comes when the person teaching you has walked the path you're trying to follow. Nate had that rare gift of making difficult concepts feel accessible without diminishing their complexity. Among those students was a shy 18-year-old named Sophie Whitmore. She'd come to Berklee through the pre-college program, spending weekends learning from professors while still finishing high school. Her father, wealthy and influential, had pushed her toward piano lessons as a child, seeing it as a social grace rather than a serious pursuit. But Sophie had fallen in love with the instrument in a way her father never understood. Nate recognized that love. He nurtured it, spending extra time with Sophie after class, helping her work through the emotional barriers that kept her technique proficient, but her performance hollow. "You're afraid," he told her one afternoon 6 months into her studies. "Afraid of what you'll feel if you let the music all the way in." Sophie, who rarely spoke more than necessary, looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "What if it's too much?" "Then, it's too much," Nate said gently. "But that's what makes it real. That's what makes it matter." He didn't know in that moment that he was teaching her a lesson that would eventually come full circle. That his own words would be tested in ways he couldn't imagine. That Sophie would one day have to carry his teaching forward when he could no longer carry it himself. But that was still to come. In this moment, in this classroom, Nate's life was complete in ways he'd never fully appreciated. He would leave Berklee each evening and drive 20 minutes to his home in Cambridge, a modest but comfortable Victorian he shared with his wife Grace and their 8-year-old daughter Lily. Grace Rivers was a violinist with the Boston Symphony Orchestra, talented enough to have her own following, but content to be part of the ensemble rather than the soloist. She and Nate had met at Juilliard 15 years earlier, two serious musicians who'd found in each other the rare combination of intellectual compatibility and profound physical attraction. Their courtship had been conducted through music speaking to each other through instruments when words felt insufficient. They'd named their daughter Lily because Grace had been playing Debussy's Clair de Lune when she went into labor, and something about that piece had always reminded them of Lily's floating on water, serene and perfect. Lily was not a musical prodigy, which relieved both her parents. They'd seen too many child prodigies burn out by adolescence, the pressure of early excellence crushing the joy that should accompany music. Lily played piano because she wanted to, learning from her father in their living room, making mistakes and laughing about them, approaching music the way children should approach everything, with curiosity and delight, rather than pressure to perform. On weekend mornings, the three of them would play together. Nate on piano, Grace on violin, Lily adding her smaller voice to theirs. The music they made wasn't perfect, wasn't performance-ready. It was something better. It was a family speaking its own language, one that didn't need words or explanations. During those sessions, Nate was composing something, a sonata that would feature both piano and violin, designed specifically for him and Grace to perform together. He called it Grace's Sonata, though Grace insisted it should be called something less embarrassingly sentimental. The piece was meant to capture their entire relationship, the initial attraction, the deep compatibility, the challenges they'd faced, the joy of Lily's arrival, the comfort of building a life together. It was ambitious, technically demanding for both instruments. Nate worked on it in stolen moments, refining passages, adjusting dynamics. He'd planned to debut it at Carnegie Hall the following spring, a special concert he'd been invited to give. It would be the pinnacle of his career, performing his own composition with his wife in one of the world's most prestigious venues. He'd finished about 3/4 of the sonata, when everything changed. It started with bruises. Small ones at first, on Lily's arms and legs. The kind that kids get from playing too hard, falling off playground equipment, being 8 years old and invincible. Grace noticed them during bath time, asked Lily about them. Lily shrugged, said she didn't know where they came from. Then came the fatigue. Lily, normally energetic and constantly in motion, started wanting to nap after school. She'd fall asleep during car rides. She'd choose quiet activities over active ones. It was gradual enough that they almost didn't notice explaining it away as a growth spurt or adjusting to a harder year at school. The nosebleed was what finally sent them to the doctor. Lily woke up one morning with blood streaming from her nose, soaking her pillow, refusing to stop despite all their efforts. Grace held a cloth to Lily's nose while Nate drove to the emergency room, both of them trying to project calm while terror clawed at their insides. The emergency room doctor ran blood tests. Standard procedure, he said, just to rule things out. They ruled things in instead: acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Lily's blood cells were attacking her body, multiplying out of control, crowding out the healthy cells she needed to survive. The oncologist who delivered the diagnosis was kind but direct. Lily would need immediate treatment, chemotherapy, possibly radiation. The prognosis was actually quite good, he emphasized. Childhood leukemia was one of the most treatable cancers. Cure rates were around 90% with proper care. 90%. Which meant 1 in 10 children didn't make it. 1 in 10 families had to learn to live with an absence shaped exactly like their child. Nate held Grace's hand in the consultation room while the doctor explained treatment protocols, hospital stays, side effects. Lily was in a room down the hall, being administered her first round of chemotherapy through an IV that looked obscenely large against her small arm. She'd been brave when they explained what was happening, nodding seriously, asking if she'd lose her hair like the kids in the commercials. Probably Grace had said, her voice breaking on the word. "That's okay," Lily said. "I can wear funny hats." 8 years old, and already trying to make her parents feel better about her cancer. The first month was a blur of hospital visits, treatment schedules, learning a new vocabulary of medical terms that no parent should have to master. Nate took a leave of absence from Berklee. Grace reduced her symphony obligations to part-time. Their world narrowed to the size of Lily's hospital room, marked by IV poles and the rhythmic beeping of monitors. The bills started arriving in the second month. Thousands of dollars for treatments their insurance classified as out-of-network or not medically necessary. Appeals were filed. Appeals were denied. The explanation of benefits letters used language designed to confuse, to obscure the fact that corporations had decided their daughter's life was worth only so much and not a penny more. Nate refinanced their house to cover the first round of bills. Then he took out loans against his retirement accounts. Grace's salary from the symphony helped, but it wasn't nearly enough. The treatments Lily needed cost more than what most people earned in a year. By the 4th month, they'd burned through their savings. By the 6th month, they were behind on their mortgage. The notices started coming polite at first, then increasingly urgent. Pay or face foreclosure. Choose between keeping your home and saving your daughter. As if it was a choice. As if any parent wouldn't burn down the world to give their child one more day of life. Nate applied for emergency financial assistance from every organization he could find. Hospitals, charities, foundations. He wrote letters explaining their situation, attaching Lily's medical records, pleading for help from anyone who might listen. One of those letters went to the Whitmore Foundation. The Whitmore Foundation, with its stated mission of supporting artists in crisis. The Whitmore Foundation, whose glossy brochures promised to be there when the unexpected happens. The Whitmore Foundation, which had given Nate an award 3 years earlier for his contributions to music education. Nate wrote to Garrett Whitmore personally, explained the situation, outlined exactly how much they needed, attached letters from Lily's doctors confirming that she was responding to treatment, but needed to continue the full protocol. He wasn't asking for charity. He was asking for a bridge for help getting through the crisis so he could return to work and pay back whatever assistance they provided. The response came 3 weeks later. A single page signed by Garrett Whitmore himself. Dear Mr. Rivers, thank you for your application for emergency assistance. After careful review, our board has determined that your situation does not align with our current funding priorities. We receive many more requests than we can fulfill, and must make difficult choices about where our resources can have the greatest impact. We wish you and your family all the best. Sincerely, Garrett Whitmore, CEO. Nate read the letter 3 times, trying to understand how his situation didn't align with their priorities. What part of accomplished musician with critically ill child failed to meet the criteria, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. There were other applications to submit, other doors to knock on, other places that might say yes where Whitmore had said no. Most of those doors stayed closed. A few opened just wide enough to provide small grants, 1,000 here, 2,000 there. Enough to delay the inevitable, but not enough to stop it. Lily fought for 14 months. 14 months of treatments that made her tiny body even smaller, that stole her hair and her energy and sometimes her hope, but never quite her smile. She learned to play simple melodies on the piano with her father during the good days, the days when the nausea wasn't too bad and the fatigue hadn't completely claimed her. Nate would sit beside her on the bench, his hands guiding hers, showing her how to find the music even when everything hurt. He'd abandoned Grace's sonata months ago, unable to work on something that had been created in a world where Lily was healthy. The unfinished composition sat in a folder in his study, a ghost of the life they'd had before. Daddy Lily said one afternoon, her voice thin but determined, "Finish your song, the one for Mommy. Later, sweetheart, when you're better." "Finish it now," she insisted with the stubbornness that proved she was still fighting. "So I can hear it." So Nate worked on it between hospital visits, between bills he couldn't pay, and phone calls from creditors he couldn't satisfy. He worked on it in the stolen hours of early morning, when exhaustion should have claimed him, but adrenaline and purpose kept him awake. He finished Grace's sonata, not in triumph, but in desperation, racing against a clock that kept ticking down. He and Grace performed it for Lily in her hospital room. Not Carnegie Hall, not a concert stage, just a small room with beeping monitors and the smell of antiseptic, and their daughter propped up in bed, her head wrapped in a colorful scarf, her eyes bright despite everything the cancer was doing to her body. They played the whole piece, 43 minutes of music that contained everything they'd felt for each other and for her. The violin and piano, wove together, separated, found each other again. Grace's fingers flew across the strings. Nate's hands danced across a portable keyboard they'd brought from home, inadequate but sufficient. When they finished, Lily applauded her small hands, making soft clapping sounds. "It's perfect," she said. "You have to play it at Carnegie Hall." "We will," Nate promised. "When you're there with us." But Lily never made it to Carnegie Hall. She died on a Tuesday morning in March, 14 months and 3 days after her diagnosis. Grace was holding one hand. Nate was holding the other. The monitor's steady beep had become a flat, endless tone that the nurses came to silence. Lily was 9 years old. She'd fought as hard as any soldier. She'd been braver than most adults. And she'd lost anyway because sometimes courage isn't enough, and love isn't enough, and trying isn't enough. Sometimes the universe just takes what you love most and doesn't bother to explain why. The funeral was attended by everyone who mattered in their life, and no one who could give them what they actually needed, which was their daughter back. Nate stood at the graveside and felt something break inside him that would never fully heal. Some griefs are too large for the human heart to hold. They crack us open, and what pours out is so dark and vast that we can never quite contain it again. Grace broke differently. Where Nate turned inward, Grace turned away. She couldn't look at him without seeing Lily. Couldn't hear his voice without hearing his promise that everything would be okay. A promise that had turned out to be a lie. She knew rationally that it wasn't his fault, but rationality doesn't help when you're drowning in grief. 6 weeks after Lily's funeral, Grace moved out. She didn't leave a note, didn't explain where she was going. She just packed 2 suitcases, took her violin, and walked out of the house they'd built together. Nate came home from a walk the first time he'd left the house in days and found half the closet empty and Grace's wedding ring on the bathroom counter. He called her phone. It went to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He called her parents, her friends, the symphony. No one knew where she was, or if they did, they weren't telling him. It took him 3 days to realize she wasn't coming back, that he'd lost not just his daughter, but his wife, his partner, the person who'd known him better than he knew himself. Grace had left, not because she didn't love him, but because she couldn't bear to love him and be reminded every day of what that love had created and lost. The foreclosure notice arrived the next week. Nate had missed 3 mortgage payments. The bank was patient only to a point, and that point had passed. He had 60 days to vacate the property or face eviction. 60 days to pack up a life. To box up Lily's room, her toys, her clothes, her piano books. To box up his and Grace's bedroom, the photographs on the walls, the sheets they'd slept on, the life they'd made. To box up Grace's sonata, the manuscript sitting in his study, a monument to a moment that would never come. He sold what he could. The piano brought in $15,000, which barely made a dent in the medical bills still arriving. Grace's symphonic contacts helped him find buyers for his recordings, his awards, his memorabilia. He let it all go without much fight, because what was the point? They were just things, and things couldn't bring back what mattered. Berklee told him his position would be waiting when he was ready to return. But Nate couldn't imagine standing in front of students and teaching them about passion and music and finding meaning through art when he'd lost the ability to find meaning in anything. He submitted his resignation via email, unable to face the campus where he'd once been someone who mattered. The medical bills kept coming. Even after Lily's death, even after they'd taken everything he owned, the bills kept coming. $30,000 for the final week of care, $18,000 for treatments that hadn't worked, $12,000 for medications that had only prolonged the inevitable. Nate ignored them. Let them go to collections. Let his credit score collapse. Let the collection agencies call at all hours. What were they going to do? Take what he didn't have. Ruin the life that was already ruined. He spent the last of his money on 6 months of rent for a tiny studio apartment in Alston. 6 months to figure out what came next, to find a way forward to rebuild something from the ruins of everything he'd been. He didn't make it 6 months. By month 3, he'd discovered that whiskey made the days bearable. By month 4, he'd discovered that whiskey wasn't enough, but vodka was cheaper and got the job done. By month 5, the landlord was knocking on his door demanding rent that Nate didn't have and couldn't get because no one wanted to hire someone whose hands shook and whose eyes were bloodshot and whose only reference was an institution he'd resigned from in disgrace. Month 6 came and went. The eviction notice was almost a relief. At least it was a decision being made for him, sparing him the burden of choosing. He left the apartment with what he could carry: 2 garbage bags of clothes, a sleeping bag, a photo album with pictures of Lily Grace better times, the manuscript of Grace's sonata folded into a plastic bag to protect it from the elements. The first night on the streets was the worst. The cold, the fear, the absolute knowledge that he'd fallen so far that there was no climbing back. But the second night was easier, and the third easier still. The human capacity for adaptation is both a blessing and a curse. We can adjust to almost anything, even our own destruction. Nate learned the geography of homelessness. Which shelters had room, which ones were safe, which ones checked for contraband, thoroughly enough that you couldn't bring in the vodka that made sleeping on a cot next to strangers bearable. He learned which soup kitchens served on which days, which churches gave out blankets, which police officers would move you along roughly, and which ones would let you sleep under the bridge if you didn't cause trouble. He stopped drinking after the first year, not out of moral revelation or recovery program success. He simply woke up one morning after spending the night in a hospital emergency room being treated for alcohol poisoning and realized that he'd tried to die and failed even at that. Something about the failure made him angry enough to stop trying. Sobriety didn't solve anything. He was still homeless, still broken, still profoundly and completely alone. But at least he was clear-headed enough to navigate survival with something approaching competence. The years blurred together. 3 years became 4, became 5. Nate watched seasons change from the perspective of someone outside all the structures that mark normal time. Christmas came and went, marked only by the increased presence of charity volunteers, who appeared briefly to assuage their guilt before retreating to their warm homes. Summers were easier on the body, but harder on the soul, all that sunshine illuminating exactly how far he'd fallen. He avoided anything to do with music, couldn't bear to hear it played on street corners or spilling out of bars, couldn't bear the reminder of who he'd been, what he'd lost. Music had been the language he spoke most fluently, and now it was a language that only brought pain. Until the night he wandered past the Boston Grand Hotel and heard faintly the sound of a piano being played at a gala inside. Until curiosity drew him closer. Until he saw through a partially open door a Steinway Model D concert grand that called to him like Grace's voice used to call him home. Until he made the decision to walk through that door and back into the world that had forgotten him, which brought him to this moment, to this bench, to these keys, to 300 wealthy strangers waiting for him to fail so they could return to their champagne and their certainty that people like him deserved exactly what they got. Nathaniel Rivers' fingers touched the keys, and for a moment nothing happened. Not because he'd forgotten how to play, but because the muscle memory was so strong, so immediate, that it overwhelmed him. The feel of ivory under his fingertips, smooth and cool and perfectly responsive. The subtle give of the keys waited precisely to translate intention into sound. The knowledge that this instrument, this magnificent creation of wood and wire and human ingenuity, was waiting to speak if he could remember how to ask. He played a single note, middle C. The sound bloomed into the ballroom pure and clear and achingly beautiful. In that one note, you could hear everything the Steinway was capable of. The richness of its tone, the sustain that seemed to last forever, the way the sound filled the space without overwhelming it. Several people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. That single note was played with too much confidence, too much control. This wasn't a person randomly hitting keys. This was someone who understood the instrument on a fundamental level. Nate played another note, then another. Simple at first, almost childlike in their innocence. A melody that might have been a nursery rhyme or a folk song, something basic enough that even amateur players could manage. The audience relaxed slightly. This was more like what they expected. A homeless man with delusions of talent playing something simple he'd heard once and memorized. But then the melody began to evolve. Nate's left hand joined his right, adding harmony underneath the simple tune. The harmony was complex, more complex than the melody warranted, hinting at deeper knowledge. His fingers moved with increasing confidence, the muscle memory overriding 5 years of disuse. Garrett Whitmore stood near the stage, his arms still crossed, his expression caught between smugness and growing uncertainty. This wasn't going the way he'd anticipated. The homeless man was actually playing. Not well enough to be embarrassing, not yet, but well enough to suggest this might not end in the disaster Garrett had hoped for. Mrs. Brennan leaned forward in her chair, her attention complete. She'd heard enough piano performances in her 83 years to recognize technique when she saw it. The way Nate's hands moved, the specific curl of his fingers, the confident touch on the keys. This was trained playing, professional playing. The simple melody was gone now, transformed into something more complex. Nate had transitioned so smoothly that no one could identify the exact moment when it happened. The music flowed through changes that suggested years of study, decades of practice. His hands moved independently, right hand carrying the melody, while the left hand provided counterpoint, the two lines weaving together in conversation. This was no longer a homeless man playing a few notes. This was a musician speaking his native language, one he'd been forcibly silent in for far too long. The audience had gone completely still. Conversations had died mid-sentence. Champagne glasses rested forgotten on tables. The string quartet, still standing off to the side with their instruments, watched with a mixture of professional admiration and confusion. Who was this person? How did he know how to play like this? Nate closed his eyes, letting the music guide him rather than conscious thought. His body remembered what his mind had tried to forget. The way your shoulders should remain relaxed, even as your hands worked furiously. The way your breathing should sync with the phrasing, taking air at natural breakpoints in the musical line. The way your foot should touch the pedal, not stomping but caressing, creating sustain and resonance without muddying the sound. The music he was playing wasn't from any known composition. This was something else, something original, something that sounded like memory, given voice, like grief, translated into sound, like 5 years of silence, compressed into melody and harmony and rhythm. This was Grace's sonata. The piece he'd finished in a hospital room while his daughter died. The piece he'd performed once for an audience of one, a 9-year-old girl who'd applauded with hands too weak to make much sound. The piece he'd packed away, determined never to play again, because playing it meant facing everything it represented. But his hands remembered. And once they started, they couldn't stop. The violin part originally written for Grace to play, Nate translated to the piano's right hand, playing it an octave higher to suggest a different instrument. The piano's left hand continued the original piano part, creating a conversation between two voices that should have been played by two people, but were being channeled through one man with 10 fingers, and more grief than any person should have to carry. The ballroom's acoustics were perfect, designed specifically for musical performances. Every note Nate played filled the space, completely reaching the farthest corners, touching everyone present, whether they wanted to be touched or not. This was the dangerous thing about live music, about art performed in real time. You couldn't turn it off, couldn't look away. It demanded your attention and gave you no choice but to feel. And what Nate was playing made people feel things they'd spent considerable money and effort to avoid feeling. The melody carried within it the sound of loss, of loving something completely and losing it anyway, of promises broken not through cruelty, but through the simple fact that the universe doesn't care about our plans or our hopes or our desperate prayers. The harmony underneath spoke of trying to hold on when everything was falling apart, of the moment when you realize that holding on is impossible, but letting go is unbearable. A woman in the third row began to cry. Quietly at first, then more openly. She was thinking about her own daughter, healthy and thriving at college, and feeling sudden, overwhelming gratitude mixed with guilt that her child had been spared what someone else's child had not. A man near the bar set down his glass and closed his eyes, transported unwillingly to the funeral of his father 3 years earlier, a grief he'd boxed up and buried because successful men didn't spend time on sadness. The music was prying that box open, and he found himself angry at this homeless man for making him feel things he'd successfully avoided for 36 months. Mrs. Brennan watched Nate's hands move across the keys and felt something click into place in her memory. She'd seen hands move like that before. Years ago, at a performance she'd attended at Berklee College, a faculty showcase featuring the school's most accomplished professors. She'd been so impressed by one particular performer, a pianist who'd played with exactly this combination of technical precision and emotional vulnerability. She couldn't remember the name. It had been too many years. But she remembered the performance, remembered thinking that this was what music was supposed to do. Strip away pretense, force honesty, make you confront what you'd been avoiding. Garrett Whitmore felt his certainty beginning to crack. This wasn't supposed to be happening. The homeless man was supposed to embarrass himself, prove Garrett right, validate all his assumptions about worth and class and who deserved consideration. Instead, the homeless man was playing music that made Garrett's carefully constructed worldview feel suddenly terrifyingly unstable. Nate moved into the middle section of the sonata, the part he'd written during Lily's final weeks. The melody turned darker here, minor chords predominating, the rhythm becoming more insistent, almost desperate. This was the section about fighting, about refusing to accept the inevitable, about rage against the dying of the light. His hands pounded the keys with force, now not harshly but insistently demanding that the piano speak louder, demanding that everyone in the room hear what it felt like to watch your child suffer and be powerless to stop it. To sit by a hospital bed night after night and will her to get better through sheer force of love, as if love had ever been enough to stop cancer or change the trajectory of cells gone rogue. The bass notes rumbled like thunder. The treble notes cried out like prayers. The music filled the ballroom until there was no room for anything else. No room for the comfortable numbness that most of these people wore, like armor against a world full of suffering they preferred not to see. And then, just when it seemed the music might shatter something, Nate transitioned into the final section, the resolution. The melody returned, transformed, now played with a gentleness that suggested not defeat, but acceptance. Not giving up, but letting go. Not forgetting, but choosing to remember with love instead of anger. This was the part he'd written after Lily died. The part he'd added to the sonata during the weeks between her funeral and Grace's departure, working on it at 3 a.m. when sleep was impossible, and the silence of the house was louder than any sound. This section was about making peace with a world that takes what you love, about finding a way to keep living when the best parts of you have died. Tears streamed down Nate's face as he played, though he wasn't aware of them. His focus was entirely on the music, on translating 5 years of accumulated pain and loss and survival into something that could be heard and understood, and maybe possibly forgiven. The audience wasn't simply watching anymore. They were participating involuntarily, conscripted into Nate's experience through the universal language of music. Some of them resented it. Most of them couldn't resist it. A few of them were grateful for it, though they wouldn't realize that until later. Nate's hands slowed the music, becoming softer, more intimate. He was approaching the ending, the final phrases that would bring Grace's sonata to its conclusion. He'd written this ending as an echo of the beginning, the same melody that opened the piece, but played with the wisdom of everything that came between. The last note hung in the air, sustained by the piano's perfect resonance and by the collective held breath of 300 people who'd forgotten how to breathe. The sound decayed slowly, naturally, following the laws of physics that govern how strings vibrate and sound waves propagate through air. And then there was silence. Complete silence. The kind of silence that's actually louder than sound, pregnant with everything unsaid, and everything felt, but not yet expressed. Nate lifted his hands from the keys and placed them in his lap. He kept his eyes closed, unable yet to face whatever came next. In this moment, suspended between the last note and the reaction to come, he felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years. He felt like himself again. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Long enough that Nate finally opened his eyes and turned slightly on the bench, looking out at the audience for the first time since he'd started playing. What he saw surprised him. Nearly everyone was crying. Not polite dabbing at the corners crying. Real crying, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and honest. Mascara ran down carefully made-up faces. Men who probably hadn't cried since childhood stared at the floor, blinking rapidly, trying to regain composure. Even the bartenders had stopped what they were doing, caught up in the wake of what they'd just heard. Mrs. Catherine Brennan was the first to move. She stood slowly, her 83-year-old bones protesting the sudden motion, and began to clap. Not the polite patter of society applause. Hard, resonant clapping that filled the silence as completely as the music had. Others joined her. One person, then 5, then 20, until the entire ballroom was on its feet, applauding with an intensity that suggested relief as much as appreciation. Relief that they could express what they'd felt, that they had permission to acknowledge the profound experience they'd just shared. The applause continued. 30 seconds. A minute. Nate sat frozen on the bench, overwhelmed by the response, unable to process that these same people who'd been laughing at him 20 minutes ago were now giving him a standing ovation. Garrett Whitmore remained seated alone in a sea of standing people. His face had gone pale, his carefully maintained composure crumbling visibly. He recognized what had just happened, even if he didn't want to. The homeless man he'd tried to humiliate had just delivered one of the most powerful musical performances this room had ever witnessed. And Garrett's cruelty was now on display for everyone to see and judge. Brennan made her way through the crowd toward the piano, moving with determined purpose. The applause began to fade as people realized she had something to say. By the time she reached Nate, the ballroom had returned to silence, but it was a different silence now. Expectant rather than awkward. Open rather than judgmental. "What's your name?" Mrs. Brennan asked gently, standing beside the piano bench. Nate's voice came out rough, barely used in hours. "Nathaniel Rivers." The name triggered something in Mrs. Brennan's memory. She turned to address the crowd, her voice carrying despite her age. "Nathaniel Rivers," she repeated louder this time. "How many of you recognize that name?" A murmur went through the crowd. Some people shook their heads. Others pulled out phones, quickly searching. A few of the older attendees, those who'd been involved in Boston's classical music scene for decades, began to show signs of recognition. Professor Rivers taught at Berklee College of Music, Mrs. Brennan continued. He performed at Carnegie Hall. He was, until about 5 years ago, one of Boston's most accomplished classical pianists. She looked directly at Nate. "Isn't that right?" Nate nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. "What happened?" Mrs. Brennan asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected. And so Nate told them. Not everything. He didn't have the strength for everything, but the essential facts. His daughter's leukemia. The medical bills that exceeded anything their insurance would cover. The desperate attempts to find help. The slow collapse of everything he'd built. His daughter's death. His wife's departure. The loss of his home, his career, his identity. He told it simply, without embellishment or plea for sympathy. Just the facts of how a life can unravel when the center cannot hold, when the thing you built everything around is suddenly, irrevocably gone. The ballroom listened in stunned silence. These were educated people, accomplished people. They knew intellectually that homelessness could happen to anyone. But knowing it intellectually and hearing it firsthand from someone who'd traveled that path were different things entirely. "I applied for help from several foundations," Nate said, his voice steady now. "Most said no. One of them was..." He stopped, suddenly aware of where he was, of who was in the audience. Was what Mrs. Brennan prompted gently. Nate met Garrett Whitmore's eyes across the ballroom. Garrett had stood at some point, his posture rigid, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. One of them was the Whitmore Foundation. Nate finished quietly. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Heads swiveled toward Garrett. Whispers erupted. Mrs. Brennan's expression hardened into something that would have been frightening if directed at you. "Is this true?" she demanded, looking at Garrett. Garrett's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. He was trapped between denying it and admitting it, both options equally damaging. His mind raced, searching for a response that could salvage this situation, but no such response existed. "We receive hundreds of applications," he finally managed. "We can't help everyone. We have to prioritize, don't." Mrs. Brennan's single word cut through his justification like a knife. "Don't insult all of us by pretending you made a considered decision. You rejected him because of your policies, your criteria, your determination of who deserves help and who doesn't." She turned back to the crowd, her outrage building. "This is what we've been celebrating tonight. This foundation that claims to support artists in crisis, that promises to be there when the unexpected happens. And when this man, this accomplished musician and educator, came to them with exactly the kind of crisis the foundation claims to address, they said no." "You don't understand the full context," Garrett tried again. "Then explain it," Mrs. Brennan challenged. "Explain to all of us how Professor Rivers didn't meet your criteria. Explain how a man who dedicated his life to music, who taught countless students, who contributed to Boston's cultural life, wasn't worthy of assistance from an organization that claims to value exactly those things. Garrett had no explanation. Or rather, he had one, but it wasn't one he could say out loud. The truth was that Nate's application had been rejected for the same reason countless others were rejected. It was easier to say no than yes. Easier to cite policy than to engage with individual circumstances. Easier to maintain distance than to risk the messiness of real compassion. The foundation's money went to safe bets, to applicants who were struggling but not too far gone, to people who could be helped with small amounts of money and wouldn't require sustained support, to situations that would look good in the foundation's annual report without demanding too much emotional investment. Nate's situation had been too complicated, too expensive, too likely to require ongoing help rather than a one-time grant. His application had been declined not because he didn't deserve help, but because helping him would have been inconvenient. A voice called out from the back of the ballroom, young and clear and absolutely horrified. Dad heads turned toward the voice. A young woman in her early 20s pushed through the crowd, her face streaked with tears, her expression devastated. Sophie Whitmore, Garrett's daughter, who'd been standing in the back throughout the performance, who'd recognized Nate the moment he sat at the piano, but couldn't believe what she was seeing. Professor Rivers. Sophie's voice broke on his name. She reached the piano and stood staring at him, taking in his weathered appearance, his torn clothing, the obvious signs of years spent on the street. Nate recognized her immediately. 5 years older, no longer the awkward teenager who'd struggled to express emotion through music, but the same Sophie, the same student he'd poured hours into helping her find her voice through the piano. "Sophie," he said softly, "you've grown up." She laughed, a sound caught between joy and anguish. "You taught me everything. Everything that matters about music you taught me." She turned to face her father, her expression a mixture of hurt and fury that only children can direct at parents who've disappointed them profoundly. "You knew," she said, her voice shaking. "When I talked about Professor Rivers, when I told you how much he meant to me, you never said you'd denied him help. You never mentioned he'd applied to your foundation." Garrett's face had gone from pale to gray. "I didn't know he was your teacher. The application came through standard channels. I didn't make the connection, because you didn't care to make it." Sophie's composure shattered completely. "I've been at Juilliard for 3 years because of what he taught me. Every performance I give, every time I sit at a piano, I'm using techniques he showed me. He's the reason I'm a musician. And when he needed help, your foundation turned him away." She looked around the ballroom at the 300 wealthy guests who'd come to celebrate the Whitmore Foundation's good works, who'd paid $5,000 per plate to feel virtuous about supporting the arts. "Do you know what Professor Rivers used to tell us?" Sophie asked, her voice carrying to every corner. "He said that music is about truth, that you can't play beautifully if you're lying to yourself, that the audience will always hear what's real and what's fake, even if they don't consciously know it." She turned back to Nate, tears streaming down her face. "You were right. Everything you taught me was right. And I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry you went through all of that alone." Nate stood from the piano bench, his legs unsteady, and did something he hadn't done in 5 years. He opened his arms and hugged someone who cared about him. Sophie fell into the embrace, crying openly now, and for a moment the ballroom witnessed something more powerful than any performance. They witnessed genuine human connection, the kind that can't be faked or purchased or orchestrated for effect. When Sophie and Nate finally separated, Garrett had moved closer. He stood a few feet away, looking older, somehow diminished. The authority he'd carried so easily at the start of the evening was gone, stripped away by the weight of his exposed cruelty. "I was wrong," Garrett said, his voice barely audible. "I was wrong about everything. It wasn't enough. Everyone in the room knew it wasn't enough. Words couldn't undo years of suffering, couldn't bring back Lily, couldn't erase the nights Nate had spent cold and hungry and alone. But they were a start. The first acknowledgement of failure. The first crack in the armor of justified indifference. Mrs. Brennan spoke into the silence that followed. "The question now is what we do about it. We can't change the past, but we can address the present and influence the future." She looked at Garrett with an expression that made clear his position at the foundation was now contingent on his next actions. "The Whitmore Foundation has failed its mission," she said bluntly. "It has prioritized bureaucracy over people, policy over compassion. That ends tonight. Either we fundamentally restructure how we evaluate applications and distribute resources, or I and every other major donor in this room walk away, and you can run your foundation on your own dime." The threat was clear and immediate. Garrett had built his reputation on the foundation's success. Without its major donors, without the social capital it represented, he would be nothing more than another wealthy man with good intentions and failed execution. "What would you have me do?" Garrett asked. And for the first time that evening, he sounded genuinely uncertain. "Start by helping Professor Rivers," Mrs. Brennan said. "Immediately. Housing, healthcare, whatever he needs to rebuild his life, not as charity, as restitution for what your foundation failed to do when it mattered." She turned to the crowd, her voice rising with passionate conviction. "And then we establish a new fund, the Lily Rivers Emergency Fund, named after Professor Rivers's daughter, dedicated specifically to helping artists and educators facing medical crises. No bureaucracy, no lengthy application process. When someone needs help, we help them. Period." The crowd erupted in applause, relief washing over them. They'd come to this gala to feel good about their charitable giving, but they'd been confronted with their own complicity in a system that helps some and ignores others. Mrs. Brennan was offering them redemption, a way to transform discomfort into action. Garrett stood silent for a long moment, processing what was being asked of him. It would mean admitting failure publicly. It would mean restructuring the foundation he'd built. It would mean acknowledging that his worldview had been catastrophically wrong. But he looked at his daughter's tear-stained face, at Nate's weathered hands, at the 300 people watching him, waiting to see if he was capable of change, or if he was just another privileged man making excuses for his lack of compassion. He walked slowly to where Nate stood beside the piano. The ballroom held its collective breath. Garrett Whitmore, CEO of the Whitmore Foundation, son of privileged man who'd spent his life believing that worth was something to be earned rather than intrinsic, lowered himself to his knees in front of Nathaniel Rivers. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry for every day you suffered, because I was too blind to see your worth. I'm sorry for every choice I made that prioritized policy over people. I'm sorry for my daughter having to learn that her father failed the person who meant most to her development as an artist." He looked up at Nate, tears running down his face, all pretense of control abandoned. "I can't undo what I did, but I can commit to doing better, to being better, to making sure no one else falls through the cracks because I'm too cowardly to confront my own prejudices." The ballroom was silent, except for the sound of Garrett's crying, raw and honest, and painful to hear. This was not how charity galas were supposed to end. Not with the foundation's CEO on his knees, not with comfortable assumptions, shattered, not with the recognition that good intentions mean nothing without genuine action. Nate looked down at Garrett, this man who'd denied him help when he needed it most, who'd contributed to years of suffering through institutional indifference. He could walk away, could reject the apology, could let Garrett live with his guilt the way Nate had lived with his loss. But Nate thought about Lily, about the lessons he'd tried to teach her before she died, about grace under pressure, about choosing compassion even when anger would be easier. He thought about Sophie watching this interaction, learning what it means to forgive or refuse forgiveness. And he thought about the music he'd just played, music that came from the darkest place in his soul, but ended with acceptance, with letting go, with choosing to remember love instead of nursing hatred. Nate extended his hand. Garrett took it, and Nate helped him to his feet. "I forgive you," Nate said simply. "Not because you deserve it, not because what you did was okay, but because holding on to this hate will destroy me more thoroughly than homelessness ever did." He paused, his voice growing stronger. "Lily wouldn't want me to carry that burden. She'd want me to play music again, to teach again, to find a way to live that honors her memory instead of being trapped by it." He looked at Sophie, then at Mrs. Brennan, then at the crowd watching with rapt attention. "But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," Nate continued. "The Lily Rivers Fund is a good start, but it has to mean something. It has to actually help people, not just make donors feel good about themselves. It has to be run by people who understand what it means to need help, not by people who've never missed a meal or worried about where they'll sleep." Mrs. Brennan nodded approvingly. "Agreed. Professor Rivers, I'd like you to be on the fund's board. To help establish the criteria review applications, ensure we're actually living up to our stated mission." Nate's laugh was surprised and genuine. "I'm homeless. I don't have an address or a bank account or any of the credentials you'd normally require." "Then we'll get you those things," Mrs. Brennan said firmly. "Starting tonight, I have a guest house that's sitting empty. You'll stay there while we find you permanent housing. The foundation will provide everything you need to get back on your feet." She turned to Garrett. "Consider it your first official act of restitution. Make it happen." Garrett nodded, wiping his eyes. "Immediately. Whatever Professor Rivers needs." Sophie hugged her father, a brief, complicated embrace that acknowledged both his failure and his willingness to change. "Thank you, Dad. This is who I need you to be." The evening had taken on a surreal quality. What should have been a simple fundraising gala had become something else entirely. A public reckoning, a moment of collective moral clarity, a demonstration that institutions can change, but only when individuals force them to. Mrs. Brennan raised her voice to address the full crowd. "Let's talk numbers. The Lily Rivers Emergency Fund needs startup capital. I'm committing $1 million tonight. Who will match me?" Hands shot up across the ballroom. Pledges were shouted out. 1 million, $500,000, 200,000. The donors who'd come to give money to feel virtuous were now giving money because they'd been forced to confront what real charity means. By the time the pledges were counted, the Lily Rivers Emergency Fund had raised $2.3 million in less than 15 minutes. More than enough to help dozens of artists and educators facing the kinds of crises that Nate had faced alone. Nate stood beside the piano, overwhelmed by how quickly his life had changed. 6 hours ago, he'd been sleeping under a bridge, wondering if he'd find food that day. Now he had housing purpose, and the promise of rebuilding a life he'd thought was permanently destroyed. Sophie stood beside him, her hand in his, anchoring him to this new reality. "Will you play something else?" she asked quietly. "Something not sad. Something that feels like a beginning instead of an ending." Nate looked at the piano, this instrument that had called him back to himself. He thought about what to play, what would be appropriate for this moment. And then he knew. He sat back down at the bench, and began to play a piece that Lily had loved. Not a famous composition, not a complex sonata, just a simple melody from an old children's song one he used to play for her at bedtime. Somewhere over the rainbow. But he played it as only a master could, taking the simple melody and surrounding it with harmonies that suggested not childish dreams, but mature hope. The kind of hope that survives loss and still believes against all evidence that better days are possible. The ballroom listened, and this time the tears were different. Not grief tears or guilt tears, relief tears, joy tears. The tears that come when you witness someone stepping back into their own life after being lost for too long. When Nate finished, the applause was gentle, appreciative, rather than overwhelming. Mrs. Brennan approached and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Welcome back, Professor Rivers," she said. "The world needs your music." Nate looked up at her, at Sophie, at Garrett, who stood a few feet away looking both devastated and hopeful at the 300 people who'd come to this gala for one reason and were leaving with something entirely different. "Thank you," he said, "for listening, for hearing not just the music, but what it meant." "That's what you taught me," Sophie said. "That music isn't just notes, it's truth. And you told the truth tonight." The gala concluded not with more speeches or structured programming, but with conversations. Small groups formed throughout the ballroom, people discussing what they'd witnessed, what it meant, how they could ensure the Lily Rivers Fund lived up to its promise. Garrett spent the evening making calls, arranging temporary housing for Nate, setting up appointments with foundation staff to begin the process of restructuring how they evaluated applications. Nate stood at the piano, his hand resting on its polished surface, barely able to believe this was real. That playing Grace's sonata had led to this. That the music he'd created in his darkest moment had become the key to finding light again. Sophie stayed with him, telling him about her studies at Juilliard, about the performances she'd given, about how his teaching had shaped everything she did musically. Her pride in him was evident and earned, and Nate felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years. He felt like a teacher again, like someone who mattered, who'd made a difference, who'd contributed something meaningful to the world. The guests began to leave around midnight, but many stopped by the piano to speak with Nate, to apologize for their initial reactions, to thank him for the performance, to pledge support for the new fund. Each conversation was a small stitch, helping to sew together the torn fabric of Nate's sense of self-worth. 6 months later, Nathaniel Rivers woke up in a bed he owned in an apartment he rented with money he earned through legitimate work. The novelty of this still hadn't worn off. Every morning he took a moment to appreciate the simple miracle of clean sheets, a warm room, and the knowledge that he wouldn't be moved along by police or harassed by strangers who saw him as less than human. The apartment was small, a one-bedroom in Cambridge that reminded him painfully and beautifully of the neighborhood where he'd once lived with Grace and Lily. He'd worried that being this close to his old life would be too difficult, but Mrs. Brennan had insisted. "You don't heal by avoiding what hurts," she'd said. "You heal by learning to live with it." She'd been right. The first few weeks had been hard walking streets that held memories on every corner. But gradually those memories stopped feeling like knives and started feeling like photographs. Still painful sometimes, but bearable. Evidence of a life lived and loved rather than a life destroyed. The apartment's second bedroom had been converted into a studio. An upright piano, not as grand as a Steinway concert model, but perfectly functional, sat against one wall. This was where Nate spent most of his time, now working on music that had been trapped inside him for 5 years, waiting for permission to exist again. He was composing an album. Grace and Lily, he called it, though Mrs. Brennan kept insisting he needed a more commercially viable title. The album would include Grace's sonata, finally recorded properly, along with 11 new pieces. Each one represented a stage of his journey, the happiness before the crisis, the loss, the years in darkness, and finally, hesitantly, hope. The recording process had been harder than Nate expected. Not technically. Despite 5 years away from the instrument, his skills had returned quickly, muscle memory, proving more durable than conscious thought. But emotionally, each piece required him to revisit experiences he'd spent years trying to forget. His therapist, provided through the Whitmore Foundation's expanded healthcare benefits, assured him this was part of healing. "You're not just remembering," she explained. "You're transforming, taking experiences that happened to you and turning them into art that can help others. That's not just survival. That's meaning-making." Nate wasn't sure he was making meaning so much as trying to survive the making process. But slowly, piece by piece, the album was taking shape. The Lily Rivers Emergency Fund had processed its first 47 applications in 6 months. 32 had been approved for assistance, receiving everything from one-time emergency grants to ongoing support for medical expenses. Nate served on the review board along with Mrs. Brennan, a social worker, and 2 other artists who'd faced similar crises. Garrett Whitmore was notably absent from the board. That had been Nate's one non-negotiable condition. He could forgive. Garrett could even respect his apparent commitment to change. But he couldn't work directly with him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Forgiveness didn't require friendship. But Garrett had kept his promises in other ways. The foundation had completely restructured its application process, eliminating many of the bureaucratic barriers that had made quick help impossible. Response times had dropped from weeks to days. Approval rates had increased significantly. And importantly, the foundation now actively reached out to communities that historically had been underserved rather than waiting for applications to arrive. The changes weren't perfect. Bureaucracy is hard to kill completely, but they were real, measurable improvements that meant people were getting help who wouldn't have been helped before. Sophie had become one of Nate's most frequent visitors. She'd come to his apartment every other week, bringing her latest pieces to play for him, asking for feedback, treating him exactly as she had when he'd been her professor, and not a man slowly rebuilding from ruins. Their sessions were the highlight of Nate's week. Hearing Sophie play, watching her grow as an artist, seeing the direct line between what he'd taught and what she'd become. It reminded him why he'd become a teacher in the first place. Not for acclaim or salary, but for this. For the profound privilege of watching someone discover their own voice. "You've gotten better," he told her, after she finished playing a challenging Scriabin etude. "More confident. You're not afraid of the difficult passages anymore." Sophie grinned. "I had a good teacher. He told me that fear is just excitement in disguise." Nate laughed. "I don't think I said it exactly like that. Close enough." Sophie's expression turned more serious. "Professor Rivers, I'm giving a recital at Juilliard next month. I'd like to premiere something. A world premiere of Grace's sonata. If you'll let me." Nate felt his throat tighten. "You want to perform it?" "The violin part too. I have a friend, incredible violinist. We've been practicing together. It's ready, but only if you're comfortable with it being public." The piece had been private for so long. Written for his wife, performed once for his daughter, then locked away like a secret too dangerous to share. The idea of releasing it into the world felt simultaneously terrifying and necessary. "Yes," he said. "I'd be honored." "Will you come to the recital?" Nate hesitated. He hadn't been in a concert hall as an audience member since before Lily's diagnosis. Hadn't trusted himself to sit through a performance without being overwhelmed by memories of who he'd been, what he'd lost. "I'll come," he said, surprising himself with his certainty. "I need to. For Lily." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "She'd be so proud of you. You know that, right? Proud of how you survived. Proud that you're making music again." "I hope so," Nate said quietly. "I hope she'd understand why I had to stop for a while. Why I couldn't touch a piano without feeling like I was betraying her memory by continuing to live." "Music didn't betray her," Sophie said firmly. "Music is how you honored her, how you still honor her. Every note you play is a promise that she mattered, that her life meant something." After Sophie left, Nate sat at his piano and played through Grace's sonata from beginning to end. He'd played it dozens of times in the past 6 months, but this time felt different. Knowing that Sophie would soon perform it publicly, that audiences would hear this intensely personal work, made each note carry additional weight. The piece had changed in his hands, not the notes themselves, but how he played them. 6 months ago at the gala, he'd played it with raw grief, barely contained anger, the sound of a wound still bleeding. Now the grief was still present, but tempered. The anger had transmuted into something more complex. Sorrow mixed with acceptance. Loss acknowledged, but not overwhelming. This was growth, he supposed. Not moving past grief, he'd learned you never fully move past losing a child, but moving through it. Finding ways to carry it that didn't crush you completely. His phone rang. Grace's name appeared on the screen, and Nate's heart jumped the way it still did when she called. They'd reconnected 2 months after the gala, cautiously, 2 wounded people testing whether healing could happen in proximity or only in isolation. Their first meeting had been at a coffee shop, neutral territory. Grace had looked older, her hair now streaked with gray, she no longer bothered to color. But her hands, when she lifted her coffee cup, moved with the same graceful precision he remembered. "I heard about what happened," she'd said. "Mrs. Brennan called me. Told me you played Grace's sonata at a gala, that it changed everything." "I thought I'd never play it again," Nate had admitted. "Thought it belonged to a version of me that didn't exist anymore. But you did play it. And you're here. That's incredible, Nate." They'd talked for 3 hours that first day. Not about reconciliation, not about trying again, just about what they'd both been through since Lily's death. Grace had her own story of survival, her own path through grief that had taken her to California for 2 years, teaching at a music camp, playing in small orchestras, avoiding Boston because it held too many ghosts. "I was angry at you," she'd admitted, "for not being able to save her. Which is insane because how could you? But grief isn't rational. I needed someone to blame, and you were there. I was angry at me too," Nate said. "Still am sometimes. Even though I know logically that there was nothing I could have done differently. That's the hardest part," Grace said. "Knowing it wasn't anyone's fault, but still needing it to be someone's fault so we have somewhere to direct all this rage." They'd been meeting regularly since then. Coffee evolved into lunch, into dinner, into walks through the Cambridge neighborhoods they'd once called home. They weren't back together. Weren't sure they ever would be. But they were present to each other again, and that was something. "Hey, Nate," answered the phone now. "Everything okay?" "Everything's good," Grace said. "I wanted to let you know I got the recording you sent. The new piece, Lily's Light." And Nate held his breath. This was the newest composition, the most difficult one emotionally. The one that tried to capture not Lily's death, but her life. Her laughter, her stubbornness, her terrible jokes, her off-key singing. "It's beautiful, Nate," It sounds like her. Like really her, not some sanitized memory of her. Relief flooded through him. I wanted to get it right. Didn't want it to be maudlin or self-pitying. Just wanted it to sound like our daughter. You did. You really did. Grace paused. I was thinking for the album. Maybe I could play on Grace's sonata. The violin part, if you want. The question hung between them, loaded with more meaning than the simple words conveyed. Playing together again would mean something. Would be a statement about their relationship, about possibility, about whether the people they'd become could still create something together. I'd like that, Nate said. I'd like that very much. They made plans to rehearse the following week. After hanging up, Nate sat at his piano, not playing, just thinking about the strange paths grief takes. How it can destroy everything, but also, if you survive long enough, how it can eventually lead to something that isn't quite healing, but is at least learning to live with the wound. His teaching had resumed as well, though not at a college. The Lily Rivers Fund had helped him establish a small nonprofit. Second Chance Music, he called it, offering free piano lessons to homeless individuals and those in transitional housing. The program started with 3 students. Now, 6 months later, he had 12. Teaching people who'd faced similar struggles to his own was different from teaching at Berklee. His students came with trauma addiction histories, mental health challenges, but they also came with determination that rivaled any conservatory student. They understood that music could be salvation, not just career or hobby. One of his students, a 43-year-old woman named Rhonda, who'd been homeless for 7 years before getting into transitional housing, had made remarkable progress. She'd never touched a piano before starting lessons with Nate. Now she could play simple pieces, was learning to read music, talked about maybe someday teaching neighborhood kids. You gave me something, she told Nate after a particularly good lesson. Not just piano skills. You gave me something to wake up for. A reason to stay clean, stay in housing. I can't mess this up because I got to practice right. This was what music could do, not solve problems. Nate had learned the hard way that art couldn't cure cancer or pay impossible medical bills, but it could provide structure, purpose, connection. It could remind people that they were still capable of learning, growing, creating. Mrs. Brennan had made Nate the fund's Director of Community Outreach, a position that came with a modest salary and significant responsibility. He'd protested at first, uncomfortable being paid by an organization that existed specifically to help people like him. But Mrs. Brennan had been characteristically blunt. You understand the population we're trying to serve better than anyone else on staff. Your lived experience is an asset, not a liability. We pay you because you're valuable, not because we pity you. The Whitmore Foundation gala had become an annual event that Nate attended, though he no longer performed. Sophie had that honor now, playing each year to open the evening, setting a tone of genuine artistry rather than society performance. The event still raised significant money, but it had taken on a different character. Less self-congratulatory, more focused on actual impact. Garrett Whitmore remained involved, though, in a diminished capacity. He'd made good on his promises to reform the foundation, but the emotional toll had been significant. His marriage had ended, though Sophie insisted it was amicable, years in the making, rather than directly caused by the gala incident. Garrett had moved into a smaller house, downsized his lifestyle, thrown himself into foundation work with what seemed like genuine commitment rather than social obligation. Nate had encountered him a few times at foundation events. Their interactions were polite, professional, marked by an awkwardness that probably would never fully dissipate. But there was also mutual respect, the kind that comes from witnessing someone's worst moment, and their commitment to do better. I think about that night constantly, Garrett had told him at the last event. About how close I came to being permanently, irredeemably that person. The person who valued optics over humanity. You're not defined by your worst moment, Nate had replied. Any more than I'm defined by mine. We're defined by what we do after, by whether we learn and grow or stay stuck. The album Grace and Lily was scheduled for release in 2 months, a small independent label one that specialized in contemporary classical music had agreed to produce it. They weren't expecting commercial success. Instrumental classical albums rarely charted, but they believed in the music's artistic merit. Nate had been interviewed by several music publications. The story of Homeless Pianist returns to music proved irresistible to journalists. He'd been careful in those interviews not to make himself into some kind of redemption story or to suggest that his path was replicable. Most people who became homeless didn't get the opportunities he'd gotten. Most didn't have the skills or connections that could be reactivated with support. His story was exceptional, and that was precisely the problem. Exceptional stories let people believe the system works for those who deserve it, when the truth was that the system failed regularly and catastrophically. So Nate used the interviews to talk about policy. About the need for universal health care so that medical crises didn't destroy families. About housing first approaches to homelessness. About how society's safety net had so many holes that falling through wasn't the exception, but the rule. Some journalists loved this angle. Others had clearly hoped for a more inspirational, less political narrative. Nate didn't care. Lily had died in part because the system failed. He wasn't going to honor her memory by pretending that individual charity could solve structural problems. The recital at Juilliard arrived on a cold November evening, almost exactly 1 year after the gala that had changed everything. Nate sat in the audience beside Mrs. Brennan, wearing a suit she'd insisted on buying him for the occasion. The concert hall was packed, standing room only. Sophie had become something of a phenomenon at Juilliard, and word had spread that she'd be premiering an unknown sonata by a Boston composer. The program listed Grace's sonata as composed by Nathaniel Rivers. Seeing his name in print in a program for a prestigious music school created an odd sensation, like meeting a version of himself that had died but was somehow still walking around. Sophie walked on stage to enthusiastic applause, followed by her violinist friend, a young man named Christopher, who moved with quiet confidence. They both settled into position, Sophie at the piano, Christopher standing with his violin ready. The hall went silent. And then they began. Hearing his composition played by others was profoundly strange. Sophie and Christopher brought their own interpretations, their own emotions to the piece. It was recognizably Grace's sonata, but filtered through their experiences, their youth, their particular technical approaches. It was beautiful. Not better than when he'd played it, not worse. Just different. Music interpreted rather than music created, which was how it was supposed to be. Nate found himself thinking about Lily, about Grace, about the long road that had led from composition to this performance. If someone had told him 12 years ago that Grace's sonata would premiere at Juilliard, performed by a student he'd taught at Berklee, he would have considered that a success. If they'd told him about everything in between the diagnosis, the deaths both literal and metaphorical, the years on the street, he wouldn't have believed survival was possible. But he had survived. Not intact, not unchanged, but survived. The final notes of the sonata faded into silence. The audience, to Nate's surprise, remained silent for nearly 10 seconds. Then applause erupted, not polite performance applause, but the kind that comes from being genuinely moved. Sophie and Christopher bowed, then Sophie gestured to the audience to where Nate sat. "The composer is here tonight," she announced. Professor Nathaniel Rivers. Spotlight found him. Nate stood reluctantly uncomfortable with the attention, but understanding that this was part of Sophie's gift to him. Acknowledgement. Recognition. The public statement that he was still here, still creating, still contributing. The applause intensified. People stood. Nate felt Mrs. Brennan squeeze his hand briefly before releasing it, her gesture saying everything that needed to be said about pride and survival and the long road back from nothing. After the concert, there was a small reception. Nate was swarmed by music students asking questions, expressing admiration, wanting to know about his compositional process. He answered as best he could, still adjusting to being treated as a person with valuable knowledge rather than as a problem to be solved or avoided. Sophie found him near the end of the evening. "Thank you for coming, for letting us play it." "Thank you for bringing it to life," Nate replied. "You played it beautifully. Better than I imagined." "I played it with love," Sophie said simply. "That's what you taught me. That technique matters, but love is what makes it real." On the train back to Boston, Nate stared out the window at the darkness rushing past. He thought about the past year, about how drastically his life had changed. He thought about the students he was teaching, the music he was creating, the tentative reconnection with Grace. He thought about Lily, always about Lily. Wondered what she would think of the man he'd become. Hoped she'd understand the years he'd spent broken. Hoped she'd forgive him for taking so long to find his way back to music. In his coat pocket, his phone buzzed. A text from Grace. "Sophie sent me the recording. You should be proud. Lily would be proud." Nate typed back, "Thank you. That means everything." Another text. "Coffee next week. I want to talk about the album recording. I'm in if you still want me." "Absolutely," Nate replied. "I'll call you tomorrow." He put the phone away and closed his eyes, letting the train's rhythm lull him into a meditative state. Not quite sleep, but not fully awake either. Somewhere in between, where thoughts drifted without demanding attention. He was 51 years old. He'd lost his daughter, his wife, his career, his home, 5 years of his life. By any objective measure, those losses were catastrophic and irreversible. But he was still here, still breathing, still capable of feeling not just grief, but also hope, not just loss, but also possibility. He was creating music again, teaching again, building relationships again, living rather than merely surviving. It wasn't the life he'd imagined, wasn't the life he'd wanted, but it was a life that held meaning, that served purpose, that honored those he'd lost by refusing to let loss have the final word. The train pulled into Boston's South Station. Nate gathered his coat and stood ready to walk back into his life. Not the life he'd had before, not even the life he'd dreamed of during those dark years on the street. But his life claimed and built piece by piece from the wreckage of everything that came before. That was enough. It had to be enough. And some days it actually was. The album Grace and Lily released on a Tuesday in March, exactly 2 years after Lily's death. It debuted at number 3 on Billboard's Classical Albums chart, which surprised everyone except Mrs. Brennan, who'd predicted commercial success based purely on the quality of the music and the compelling backstory. Critical response was overwhelmingly positive. The New York Times called it a masterwork of emotional honesty, translated into musical language that speaks to universal experiences of loss and resilience. NPR's All Things Considered did a feature segment. Several pieces were picked up by streaming platforms Focus and Contemplative Playlists. But the response that mattered most to Nate came from listeners who reached out directly. Letters, emails, social media messages. People who'd lost children, who'd faced financial ruin from medical crises, who'd experienced homelessness or addiction or mental health catastrophes. People who heard in Grace and Lily their own stories, their own struggles, validation that they weren't alone in their pain. One email came from a woman in Arizona whose son had died of brain cancer. "I couldn't listen to music for 3 years," she wrote. "Everything felt disrespectful to his memory, like I was trying to move on when moving on felt like betrayal. But your album gave me permission to feel everything, the love, the loss, the anger, the acceptance. Thank you for being brave enough to share this." Messages like that reminded Nate why art mattered. Not for awards or chart positions or critical acclaim, though those were gratifying, but because honest expression of difficult emotions gave others permission to feel their own feelings fully, to acknowledge pain without being consumed by it. The Lily Rivers Emergency Fund continued to grow both in resources and impact. By the 2-year mark, it had helped more than 200 artists and educators, providing over $4 million in emergency assistance. The fund's model had been adopted by 3 other arts foundations nationally, spreading the philosophy that bureaucracy should serve people rather than protecting institutions. Garrett Whitmore remained involved, but in the background. He'd become something unexpected, an advocate for systemic reform, speaking publicly about how foundations could do better, testifying before legislative committees about the need for universal health care and housing support. His transformation appeared genuine, though Nate knew that some people would never trust. It would always see Garrett as the man who denied help when it was needed most. That was fair, Nate thought. Actions have consequences, and Garrett's actions had caused real harm. Redemption wasn't owed just because someone claimed to have changed. It had to be earned through sustained commitment over time. Sophie graduated from Juilliard with highest honors and immediately began a performance career that seemed destined for significant success. She played Grace's sonata at her graduation recital and announced that her first album would feature Nate's compositions alongside established classical works. Father and daughter reconciliation had progressed slowly, Garrett learning to show up for Sophie in ways he hadn't before. Sophie learning to set boundaries while remaining open to relationship. Grace and Nate continued their careful dance of reconnection. They'd recorded Grace's sonata together for the album, a process that had been both beautiful and excruciating. Playing together again after years apart, creating music that memorialized their daughter and their relationship forced them to be vulnerable in ways they'd both been avoiding. They weren't back together romantically. Might never be, but they'd become friends again. Co-parents in grief, people who could share memories of Lily without it destroying them. That felt like its own kind of miracle. Nate's teaching program, Second Chance Music, had expanded to serve 40 students across 3 locations. Several of his first students had progressed enough to start teaching others, creating a ripple effect of musical education, spreading through communities that had been written off by traditional music programs. Rhonda, his star student, had just received a stipend from the Lily Rivers Fund to pursue a community music education certificate at a local college. At 43, she was returning to formal education for the first time since dropping out of high school at 16. "I want to do what you did for me," she told Nate. "Show people that it's never too late, that music doesn't care how old you are or where you've been." As the 2-year anniversary of Lily's death approached, Nate found himself in his apartment studio, working on a new composition. This one wasn't about loss. It was about the tiny moments of joy that somehow persist even through grief. Morning coffee, sunlight through windows, the satisfaction of a student finally mastering a difficult passage. Grace's laugh heard during a phone call sounding almost like it used to. The piece was tentatively titled Small Mercies, and it was proving harder to write than any of his grief compositions. Apparently, hope required different musical vocabulary than sorrow, required believing that good things could last, that joy wasn't just a brief interruption before the next catastrophe. His phone rang. The Whitmore Foundation's main number. Nate answered, curious. "Professor Rivers, this is Michelle from the fund office. We have an application I think you should review personally." "What's the situation?" "Single mother jazz vocalist just diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. She's asking for help with childcare during treatment and some rental assistance. Her application is strong, but given the amounts involved, I wanted your input." Nate thought about answering this call 2 years ago, about being on the other side of this equation, about writing desperate letters to foundations and waiting for responses that either came too late or didn't come at all. "Approve it," he said. "Whatever she's asking for, approve it. Today. Don't make her wait. I'll process it immediately." "Thank you, Professor Rivers." After hanging up, Nate sat at his piano and played a few measures of the new composition. The melody emerged haltingly, searching for the right notes to express something that words couldn't quite capture. The feeling of having been broken but not destroyed. Of losing everything but somehow impossibly finding reasons to keep going. He thought about that night at the gala 2 years ago. Standing in a ballroom wearing torn clothing, being judged by strangers, finding the courage to sit at a piano and play music that represented his entire shattered life. If someone had told him then that it would lead to this, to housing, purpose, reconnection, hope, he wouldn't have believed them. But that's the thing about rock bottom. It teaches you that survival is possible even when it seems impossible. That humans are more resilient than we imagine. That sometimes the breaking open of everything is what finally lets light in. The doorbell rang. Nate closed the piano lid and answered. Grace stood in the hallway holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing a small smile. "Thought you might want company," she said. "And caffeine." Nate stepped aside to let her in, feeling grateful for this small mercy, this unexpected gift of her presence. They sat at his kitchen table drinking coffee, talking about nothing important and everything important. Music students, memories, plans. Outside March, rain fell on Cambridge. The same rain that fell on everyone housed and homeless, grieving, and joyful, lost and found. The rain that nourished the earth and made spring possible, that washed away some things and revealed others, that reminded everyone that change was constant and survival required adaptation. Inside, Nathaniel Rivers sat with his ex-wife drinking coffee in an apartment he could afford because strangers had chosen compassion over judgment. He'd lost his daughter, lost years of his life, lost almost everything that mattered. But he was still here, still creating, still teaching, still proving that worth isn't something granted by institutions or determined by circumstances. It's inherent, persistent, unkillable, even by the worst that life can do to you. He'd been homeless, hungry, forgotten. He'd been cruel to himself in ways no one else could match. He'd wanted to die sometimes when living seemed unbearably hard. But he'd played piano at a charity gala. And that one act of courage, that decision to let his hands remember who he'd been, had started a cascade of changes that led to this moment. To coffee with Grace, to students learning music, to an album carrying his daughter's name into the world, to proof that endings can sometimes be beginnings in disguise. The world hadn't become fair. The systems that had failed him continued to fail others. But within that broken system, cracks had appeared where light could enter, where compassion could take root, where one person's courage could inspire others to be better, do better, see each other more completely. That night alone in his studio, Nate finished Small Mercies. The final section captured something he'd been reaching for throughout the composition. Not happiness exactly, not the absence of grief, but the coexistence of sorrow and joy, loss, and hope, ending and beginning. He played it through once, then again. On the third playing, he recorded it, knowing it might become part of his next album, might reach listeners who needed permission to feel complicated emotions without apology. Before bed, Nate did what he did every night. He looked at Lily's photo, the one that sat on his nightstand. 9 years old forever, her smile bright and genuine, her eyes showing the courage that had carried her through 14 months of fighting a battle she couldn't win. "I'm still here, baby girl," he whispered to the photo. "Still making music, still trying to honor your memory by living as fully as you did. I hope that's enough. I hope that makes you proud." The photo didn't answer because photos can't. But in the silence, Nate felt something that might have been peace, might have been acceptance, might have been the beginning of believing that he deserved the life he was rebuilding one note at a time. Outside, rain continued to fall. Inside, a man who'd been homeless and forgotten had become once again a musician and teacher and human being who mattered. Not because of what he'd achieved or who'd helped him, but because he'd never stopped being those things, even when the world couldn't see it. Worth isn't earned, it's inherent. And sometimes it takes losing everything to remember that truth. If you've ever judged someone without knowing their story, this is your invitation to look closer. If you've ever walked past someone experiencing homelessness and convinced yourself they deserved their situation, this is your reminder that no one knows what path led them there. If you've ever dismissed someone's worth based on their appearance or circumstances, this is your challenge to see deeper. Because every person you encounter has a story, has lost something loved, something survived something, has worth that exists independent of your recognition of it. Nathaniel Rivers played piano at a charity gala and changed his life. But the real change happened when strangers chose to listen, to see, to recognize his humanity, despite every reason society gave them to look away. That choice is available to all of us every day. The choice to see worth instead of dismissing it, to offer compassion instead of judgment, to recognize that the distance between housed and homeless, successful and struggling, worthy and worthless, is far shorter than we want to believe. Music saved Nathaniel Rivers, but compassion brought him back. And the same compassion that transformed his life is waiting dormant but available in all of us. We just have to choose to use it.